Hi, this is Chloe McCracken from Inner Whispers, and in this video in the Learn Lenormand training series we'll be looking at blending cards and creating sentences. So doing small readings or readings with a small number of Lenormand cards. And this is a skill which you can obviously then expand to the larger readings. So it's something that it's very good to practice on and get a good firm grip on. You can do very powerful small readings with the Lenormand cards, and it will also help you as a practice when you want to move on to larger spreads, if you want to move on to larger spreads. With these exercises, it really is an exercise-based learning. So please do stop the video and give the sentences or the blends a go yourself before looking at my suggested answers. And they really are just that, suggested answers. There are multiple possible ways of interpreting cards, always. And so find what works for you first before looking at those. Perhaps you can either stop the video or you could work through the PDF in its entirety before coming and watching this video, whatever feels better for you. So with that being said, let's move on and look at the cards. The first thing to say is that traditionally, when reading the cards, there wasn't necessarily a difference between seeing the cards in a particular order if you're thinking about combinations. So for example, with the tower and the boat, it really didn't matter if you had the tower first and then the boat, or the boat first and then the tower. It was kind of read the same as a blended thing of institutional travel or a CEO travelling, any of those kinds of interpretations of these two cards together. So traditionally the order of the pairs didn't matter, except in a few particular cases. And which cases these are vary from school to school. So I'm going to give you information about the way that different schools have sort of used this idea of directionality with cards, and try and point out which ones are the most used, which ones perhaps less so. But really it is a question of just finding what works for you. You may decide that you don't want to use any kind of directionality from the images in the cards, or that you want to incorporate all of these, or that you do it sometimes and not other times. Once again, it's all about what works for you in reading. So the cards which are sometimes read with this sense of directionality are the rider, the clouds, the coffin, the scythe, the mice, the book, and the cross. We'll take a look at each of those in turn. So for example, with the rider, we have questions like, does the rider bring a message to you? Does the message miss you? Or does it come from you? In this particular card, we have the rider riding to the right side. So if the person card was just in front of him, then you would say that he's bringing a message to them. But if he's on the other side, then you would say that perhaps he's riding away from them, that's missed his message, or that the message has been and gone, or potentially it could be that the message is coming from that person, though that is a less usual approach to understanding the rider's message. It normally is something that's coming to you rather than being from you. But once again, find what works for you. The clouds are probably the card where this idea of directionality is used the most often across all schools. And so the questions here are, which way does the person face? And therefore, are the clouds in front of them or behind them? And which side of the clouds is closest to them or to the subject card of the subject you're reading about? Is it the dark side or the light side? If the dark side is next to the person or the particular subject, then it suggests reading the more negative aspect of this card, that it's really confusing, uncertain, perhaps about depression for a person. And if it's the light side, then you can say, well, there have been troubles, but they are now passing, or that things are a little bit uncertain, but it will blow over, that kind of interpretation. The Coffin is one card which is read with directionality, not all that frequently, but it is a possibility. And traditionally the idea was that you looked at which side of the coffin the black cloth was draped on. And most traditionally that was on the left-hand side. So then the idea is that that side is more negative or suggests where things are ending, perhaps. And to honour that tradition, in the Celtic Lenormand, I put a corvid flying towards the left, so it still gives that idea of the blackness to the left of the card. The scythe is one that's used quite often, most especially with the idea of which side is the cutting edge of the blade, or where is its point facing. That's the bit that gets cut. In some schools, especially the German school, there's also a question about, well, if you're not on the cutting side, the other side is a wooden handle, and if you bump up against that, you can get knocked out by being hit by a great big wooden staff. So it's still quite sudden and impactful, but it's not as cutting, perhaps not as painful, not as terminal, shall we say. It's not totally cut, finished. It could just be a bit of a ding, so to speak. With the mice, once again, there can be a sense of directionality. For example, people ask which way is the main mouse, or the mouse at the front, or all the mice, which way are they facing? And based on that, you might say, well, they face the side that they're nibbling away at, that they're undermining, and the other side is the side for poop, and so therefore that would be the side that's perhaps polluted, tainted, tarnished, caused to degrade in some way. The book is another card which sometimes is used with directionality, and I've had quite a few different notions on this. For example, is the book open or closed? If the book is closed, that suggests that it's more about secrets and mysteries, things that are hard to uncover. If the book is open, it's an open book, so there's less of the mystery side, perhaps more of the study side. Also, some people look to which side is the spine facing, and I always thought of that in terms of the side of the pages is the bit that you can open. However, I've heard that some other readers actually see it as the side with the spine is the side where you can read the title, so that's where you can get information, whereas the other bit, yes, it's the pages side, but it is currently closed, therefore you can't get information from that side. So there's a number of different options there with the book that you can keep in mind. And the cross is perhaps one of the most complicated. This I only normally see used in this way in the German school, but I'm going to mention it anyway out of interest and so on. Here the idea is that if the cross is above the card of the person or of the subject that you're talking about, then that's what it is crushing. Below, that's something that it's lifting up, giving a boost to, perhaps a spiritual lift. If it's behind the person card or the subject card, then it's actually offering support, something that they can lean against. Whereas if it's in front, then it's definitely the more burdensome side. It's the side where you feel like you're pushing against something, or that you have a cross to bear, a big burden, sorrow, a big life lesson perhaps. So those are the directionality aspects of those cards, if that's something that you want to choose to use in your readings. As I say, traditionally, the idea was that two cards together were always interpreted the same. That combination had a set meaning almost. But as Lenormand reading has developed, we've become a little bit more fluid in how we read the cards. And so these days there is a tradition of saying that the card to the right influences the card to the left, and the card to the left is the thing being described. And so in that way you would get different kinds of readings if you have the ship and the clover, or the clover and the ship, in that order. So I'd like you to think about how might these two pairs be read differently based on the keywords for each of them. Take a moment to think about that. And here are some suggestions. For the clover with the ship, we could see a nostalgic opportunity, a foreign coin, so the ship describing the clover, foreign for ship, coin for clover, or an international opportunity. And if we have the ship followed by the clover, then it's the ship that is being described, so it would be a lucky journey or a synchronous venture, for example. When we think about blending cards, there's a number of different ways that we can do it. For example, you can blend two cards, but you can also blend more cards. And so we'll look at these different options to get a feel for that. And a final question is, do you create a blend or a sentence or both? So we'll look at both the idea of blending the cards and of sentences a little bit later on. With the house and the bouquet, we might, for example, see a beautiful house, a creative family, or an invitation to someone's home. With the house, the bouquet and the ship, we might be looking at a creative foreign family, a beautiful houseboat, a secure venture in art, or a comfortable, beautiful journey. With the house, the bouquet and the tree, so just changing one of the cards, we change it to a beautiful ancestral home, a family of long-standing creativity, or an invitation to a tree house. So that's the way of kind of blending the cards, that you combine their meanings into a single thing. We can also use the cards to create sentences, much like we would with tarot cards reading a past, present, future, for example. And there's a number of different ways that we can do this. My suggestion is always to start by brainstorming keywords, then brainstorm blending the pairs, and then try putting the words together in different combinations. And there's another video in this series where we'll look at that in more depth with a specific exercise for brainstorming and creating sentences in this way to flex your Lenormand intuitive muscles. So when creating sentences, there are a number of different things to consider. For one, are you going to use an odd or an even number of cards? And when might that matter? Then I've put here a number of different ways of reading a small section of cards, a small number of cards. We could use it as a past, present, future, a theme with a combination leads to, a significator and its related cards, a central issue with surrounding considerations, and we may also consider mirroring in the reading as a different way of combining the cards. So if we start with past, present and future, and this little 3-card reading, we have the dog, the heart and the clouds. So if you read that as a past, present and future, what would you get? We might see, for example, that someone who was a friend has become something more emotionally. However, the future with them seems uncertain. If we pull in a 4th card, so we now have the dog, the heart, the clouds and the paths, what difference does that make to our interpretation using this same past, present, future? My suggestion was, someone who was a caring friend now seems emotionally less clear, and you may need to decide whether you can accept this lack of certainty. So with these, we're always blending the bits together. So a caring friend is the dog with the heart, and emotionally less clear is the heart with the clouds, and needing to decide about uncertainty is the clouds with the paths. So you see that you're kind of blending each pairing as you form the sentence. And I think that's quite an important part, that it's not necessarily just blending or just creating a sentence, that you can do both of those within a single interpretation, and more, which we'll come to later. So if we read these instead as a theme with a combination, we get something that's perhaps a little bit different. We could say that the theme is a friend or a caring friend or a friend with heart issues, and the combination suggests a lack of emotional clarity or that they are worried about their heart issues. So there, the theme of a friend is just taking the dog by itself, whereas if we combine the dog with the heart, then the theme is the caring friend or a friend with heart issues. So this is the way that we're structuring it, taking one or two cards as the theme and then what follows after as the combination or combinations. If we add in that same fourth card, we get something else. The theme is a caring friend, a loving friend, a friend with heart issues. The combinations suggest unclear emotions may necessitate a choice, or that a caring choice is to accept uncertainty, or that uncertainty around their heart will require a decision. So you can see that there are a number of different options that you can get from this way of reading with the theme and the combinations. And which one is relevant is going to depend on the context and what you see in the cards. We can also take 3 or 4 cards, as we have been, and consider them as a combination which leads to something else, rather than the theme and the combinations. And it will give us something that's a little bit different, a slight nuance on that, I think. So, for example, with the dog, the heart and the clouds, we have an emotional friend leads to uncertainty or depression, or a friend who is emotional leads to ambiguities. Adding in the paths card, we can expand on that. Uncertainty around a friend who is emotional leads to having to make a choice. A friend's heart problems lead them to making cloudy judgments, or a friend feeling emotional leads to cloudy judgments. We can also read these small spreads as, for example, a central issue and the considerations around it. So, for example, with the heart as the centre and the dog and the clouds around it, we could say emotions are at the heart of the question, and you need to consider both how it will affect the friendship and whether you can accept the lack of clarity in this question. Or, a different version, in a question of love, how does uncertainty affect your sense of loyalty? Adding in the paths card once again gives us something a little bit different. At the centre we now have the heart and the clouds, so the central issue is ambiguous emotions, and consider loyalty when making a decision. If you are uncertain about whether this is really love, consider what choices you would make for this person and what the friendship means to you. So in this way of reading with the central issue and surrounding considerations, we are in fact using mirroring, so we are sometimes combining the 2 cards on the outside, connecting them up, rather than only connecting cards that lie next to one another. And that's a technique that we'll talk about in a little more detail momentarily. Because we can use this as well when we have a significator card and look at the surrounding cards to it. There, some people choose to still read the significator card within the actual interpretation, while others consider it as kind of the central card which is determining the theme of the reading. You've actually looked for that card in order to know what your question was, so to speak, or based on your question you choose a card that you will look for, you shuffle the cards up and then you look through to find that card. So if you're asking about love, you would look for the heart. If you're asking about a particular person, you might look for the man card or the woman card, the lord or lady card. And if you're asking about a contract, you might look for the ring, or if you're asking about a course of study, you might look for the book, so on. So that's kind of how you do this reading. And then the way that you interpret it, you can either include the central card in your interpretation, or else you can just look at the surrounding cards saying, well, you know, that central card is just the placeholder to show me where I'm supposed to look. So once again, it's about choices. So for example, with this line, we could say, academic news regarding health suggests a deceptive rash. Academic news is the Tower and Rider. It's about health, so we're not blending that in. And then a deceptive rash is the Stars and the Fox. Or if we do want to include the tree as the health card within that, then we might instead read it as, A message from a health institution is coming regarding a skin specialist. And in that same line we can see the way that we might mirror, because we could connect Ryder and Fox as news from a specialist and Tower and Stars as a scientific institution. So melding that in, it would be that news from a specialist who is working at an institution gives us, or a scientific institution gives us news about our health, which might include a rash or that this is a skin specialist. So it's not really a different reading, but it's adding a little bit more nuance, that the letter itself doesn't come just from an administrator within the health institution, it comes from a specialist within that scientific institution connected with health. So we might be talking about a teaching hospital or something like that, where it's a health but it's institution and also scientific. So these are the kinds of subtleties that you may choose to draw out of a reading of this sort. So a final sort of question or discussion on this is about the reading choices when you do this sort of reading. I ask, do you decide before you begin which way of interpreting you're going to use? And my suggestion would always be to decide that beforehand, because otherwise, as you can see, there are differences in the interpretations, and you may end up with a question of, well then, what on earth does it mean? Whereas if you decide at the outset and you stick to that, then you have clear boundaries to your reading that help it to be more specific, more focused, and therefore more useful. However, within that, if something just jumps out at you as soon as you see the cards, I would always follow that intuitive kick, that intuitive feeling and knowing. Even if you had planned something different, if it's just so obvious to you, go with that. And finally, a little question about what are different ways to practice reading. Obviously you can do readings for yourself, and it doesn't have to be on big life-altering questions. You can read about almost anything to keep your practice going. But if you do want to read on different subjects than just yourself, then some ways that I have found very interesting and enlightening are, for example, to read around a television show. Say you either are about to watch a show or you've just started watching it, then you could draw cards to see how things are going to progress in the story, and then check back later and see how well did your interpretation fit with what actually happened. That can be quite a nice, fun way of doing it. Or you could read around current affairs so that you will get an answer at some point and are able to see what you saw compared with how things actually turned out. Or else you could also read for historic figures, people from the past, something like that. Personally, I don't tend to like doing celebrity readings in the sense that it feels kind of intrusive, a bit like a third-party reading, that you're reading about someone who is a very real person, and if they knew you were reading about them, they might feel something about that fact. So that's not something that I choose to do, but it's a personal choice always. So I hope that you found this video useful and that you will go out and practice reading, creating blends, combining cards, and also creating sentences.